Hi there, Scott Wheeler here, and I'd like to have a look at the example of that woman who had the issue of blood and how that relates to us in the New Testament and just also the typology of it. Now, we start in Leviticus chapter 15, and I'm reading from verse 19, and it says, "When a woman has a discharge, and her discharge is blood from her body, she is to be in her menstruation 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during this time will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches any furniture she sits on must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. If there is something on the bed or on the furniture she sits on, when he touches it, he will be unclean until evening. And if a man actually has sexual intercourse with her, so that her menstrual impurity touches him, then he will be unclean 7 days, and any bed he lies on will be unclean. When a woman's discharge of blood flows many days, not at the time of her menstruation, or if it flows beyond the time, all the days of her discharge of impurity will be like the days of her menstruation. She is unclean. Any bed she lies on during that time will be unclean. Any furniture she sits on will be unclean, and anyone who touches them will be unclean, and will have to wash their clothes and bathe until evening." And so when you consider this, and we now go to Luke chapter 8, and we read in verse 43, and it says, "Now a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years, but could not be healed by anyone." You get a sense now how desperate the situation was. So under the law, a woman would start her menstrual cycle. She would go into isolation, and there would be no interaction with her, no physical touching. No one would touch anything she touched or touch the bed or the furniture. And she would be like that for 7 days. And on the 8th day, she would go show herself to the priest. And if the bleeding had stopped, he would declare her clean again. So in a sense, she was almost treated like a leper during that period of time. Now, consider this woman. She goes into her usual menstrual cycle, and she goes into isolation. Now, the scripture doesn't say she had a family, but let's assume she did, just for the sake of the example. And so she's in isolation, and there's no touching, there's no affection during that time. No one wants to go into the room she's in, touch anything she's touched. And so in reality, she's totally isolated for that period of time. On the 8th day, as per usual, the bleeding would have stopped, and she could have gone to the priest and been declared clean. The bleeding continues. She's unclean into day 8. And then the following day, and then it's another week, and then it was a month, and then it was 6, and then it was a year, and eventually 12 years later, this woman has an encounter with Jesus. Can you begin to imagine the kind of life she was living for those 12 years? No one wanting to touch her. If she had had a family, that family would have disintegrated. They would have thrown her out or left her and moved out. No one wants to visit or associate with this woman. Definitely no one's going to touch anything she touches. And so everything she had in terms of material possessions, out of utter desperation, she spends to try and be healed from this bleeding. And the scripture says she suffered at the hands of many physicians, and none of them could remedy it. And so she's treated unclean like a leper for 12 years. The trauma this woman would have lived, the complexes she would have developed, the suffering that she had been put through, the rejection that she had faced is just beyond our comprehension. And so for 12 years, she lives this kind of a life. Now, in parallel, this is how we are in sin, which makes us unclean. And we're isolated from the love of God. We're isolated from the blessings of God. We're isolated from the forgiveness of God. We're isolated from the love of God and the affection of God. We're left in a place of desperation and suffering, and we suffer at the hands of many things. And just like this woman, we live in this world and we're unclean, cut off from the life of God. And the scripture says in verse 44, she came up behind Jesus, having seen him in this crowd, and she touched the edge of his cloak, and at once, the bleeding stopped. Isn't this remarkable? And in the same way, in our salvation, the scripture teaches us that every one of us are under the curse of the law. And God has given the law, and the law is so perfect, so righteous, so just, that it condemns every human being, so that there are none righteous, not even one. We are all declared to be sinners. The law shows us how nasty and sinful we are, and it magnifies sin, and it just slays us. Like that woman, that law had finished her off. And yet, through faith, to he who believes, he will be saved. And in a moment, you and I, we believe. Immediately, we are justified. We are made right with God. We are cleansed of all our sin. We are clothed in his righteousness. We become the sons of God, new creatures in Jesus. And immediately, her bleeding stops. Then Jesus asked, and he says, who is it that touched me? When all had denied it, Peter said to him, Master, the crowds are surrounding you and they're pressing in around you. How can you ask who touched you? So many people are touching you. But Jesus said in verse 46, someone touched me, for I know that power has gone out of me. And in another picture here, how many touch Jesus? How many attend church? How many come to the institution or the building, or they read their Bible, or they listen to a sermon, or they pray a prayer, or they have a moment where they touch him, but they touch him for the wrong reason. We touch him because we want something answered. We want something fixed. We want out of a circumstance. But this woman, she was so desperate. She had spent everything else. She had no other option. Jesus was everything to this woman. In that moment, she put all her faith in him. She touched him believing, and power flowed out of him, and he felt it. And the reality today is so many are touching Jesus with the wrong motive, for the wrong reason, and no change comes to their lives. But for those who are desperate, for those who have realized that there is no way out of this thing, Jesus is our only hope. When you call upon his name, you will be saved. And when the woman saw that she could not escape notice, she came trembling and fell down before him in the presence of all the people, and she explained why she had touched him and how she had been healed immediately. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. An incredible account of how that woman was freed that day. And by her believing, the bleeding stopped. And you and I, we need to be freed from sin, because we're under a greater curse than that woman. We're not just under the law of blood. We're under the law of Christ that has totally slain us. And the soul that sins will surely die. And this is not just a physical death that Jesus is talking about, but the consequence is not that we just be unclean for a period of time. We will spend eternity in the lake of fire, in torment, as a result of not having met the righteous requirement of the law, which is impossible to meet. That's why we've got to come to the understanding that I cannot save myself. I've got to put my faith in Jesus Christ. And then I want to read this one last verse in the book of Romans and chapter 10, and it says this in verse 4. For Christ is the end of the law, with the result that there is righteousness for everyone who believes. Christ is the end of the law. The moment that woman came to Jesus, that law had no more power over her. And in the same way, We are under the curse of the law until the day we come to Jesus Christ. And the moment we believe upon Jesus, Jesus is the end of the law to those who believe. You want to spend the rest of your life living under the curse of the law and the burden of that law, and what that law does, and how that law separates, and how that law isolates, and how that law is judged and written us off? Or do you want to be free? Come to Jesus. Believe upon Him. And Jesus is the end of the law to those who will believe.